November 14, 1965. Landing Zone X-ray, Ia Drang Valley, Central Highlands of South Vietnam. 10:48 in the morning. The pen barely moved as First Lieutenant James Riley scribbled in his field notebook, his hands still trembling from the firefight that had erupted moments after the helicopters departed. "The rifle in my hands just saved my life," he wrote, "but I watched 3 men die today because theirs would not fire." Through the elephant grass and triple canopy jungle, approximately 14 miles west of Plai Mi Camp, American soldiers of the 1st Cavalry Division Air Mobile had just experienced their first major battle against regular North Vietnamese Army forces. 450 men of Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, had been inserted by helicopter into a clearing at the base of the Chupong Massif. Within minutes of landing, they had made contact with elements of the North Vietnamese Army's 66th Regiment. What would become a 3-day battle had begun. The new M16 rifle, rushed into production and shipped to Vietnam with promises of revolutionary firepower, had performed flawlessly for some units. For others, it had failed catastrophically. What none of them knew was that this moment would trigger one of the most devastating equipment failures in American military history, a systematic collapse of trust between soldiers and their primary weapon that would cost hundreds of lives before congressional intervention forced urgent reforms. The mathematics of this tragedy were being written not in battle plans, but in jam rates, powder specifications, and chrome plating decisions that had prioritized cost savings over soldier survival. The crisis had begun not in the jungles of Vietnam, but in the boardrooms of the Pentagon and the production facilities of American defense contractors. The weapon that would become the M16 started its life as the Armalite AR-15, designed in the late 1950s by Eugene Stoner. Born in 1922, Stoner had served as a Marine in the South Pacific during World War II and later worked as a machinist and design engineer. His revolutionary approach to rifle design challenged every assumption about military weapons. The AR-15 was first revealed at Fort Benning, Georgia in May 1957. This lightweight rifle, weighing just 6.37 pounds compared to the M14's 9.2 pounds, fired a small-caliber 5.56mm round at extremely high velocity. The cartridge itself, based on the commercial .223 Remington round, pushed a 55-grain bullet at over 3,000 feet per second. Early tests with Special Forces units in 1962 showed remarkable results. The rifle's light recoil allowed soldiers to maintain accurate fire even in full automatic mode. High ammunition capacity meant soldiers could carry 300 rounds in the same weight as 180 rounds of 7.62mm ammunition for the M14. The devastating wounding capability of the high-velocity round made it ideal for the close-quarters jungle combat of Southeast Asia. Air Force Security Police units adopted the rifle enthusiastically and reported excellent results. But between those promising early trials and full-scale deployment lay a series of decisions that would transform a revolutionary weapon into a death trap. In January 1963, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara concluded the AR-15 was superior to the M14 and ordered a halt to M14 production. In November 1963, he approved orders for 85,000 XM16E1s, overriding objections from Army brass who remained loyal to the heavier M14. Production began in March 1964. The decision was driven partly by cost, partly by the urgent need for weapons suited to Vietnam's unique combat environment, and partly by McNamara's faith in systems analysis and modern technology over traditional military thinking. The rifle McNamara ordered, however, was not the rifle that had performed so well in early testing. The changes began with the ammunition. Eugene Stoner had designed the AR-15 to fire cartridges loaded with IMR 4475, a stick powder manufactured by DuPont. This powder produced specific pressures and a cyclic rate of fire around 800 rounds per minute. The combination had been carefully engineered to work with the rifle's direct gas impingement system, where propellant gases were channeled directly back into the bolt carrier to cycle the action. In January 1963, DuPont informed the Army that it could not mass-produce IMR 4755 to meet the demanded specifications and timeline. The powder worked perfectly in small, controlled batches, producing consistent velocities and pressures, but scaling up to produce millions of rounds while maintaining lot-to-lot consistency proved impossible. The extruded stick powder required precise control of temperature, humidity, and cutting processes. Even minor variations between batches could affect chamber pressures and velocities. The Army needed millions of rounds immediately for Vietnam deployment. DuPont could not deliver.
The Army and Olin Matheson both understood that WC-846 burned differently than IMR-4475. The ball powder generated higher peak pressures and maintained those pressures longer as the bullet traveled down the barrel. This produced higher port pressures at the gas port location. The increased gas pressure meant more propellant gas was diverted back through the gas tube into the bolt carrier. This increased the violence of the action cycling and raised the cyclic rate of fire from around 800 rounds per minute to between 850 and 1,000 rounds per minute. More critically, WC-846 contained calcium carbonate as a stabilizer and deterrent coating. The calcium carbonate helped control the burn rate of the powder, but left significantly more fouling residue than IMR-4475. In traditional rifle designs with gas piston systems, this increased fouling went into the gas piston and could be cleaned from outside the action. But the M16 used direct gas impingement. Every bit of that calcium carbonate residue was blown directly back into the bolt carrier, the bolt, and most critically, the chamber itself with every single shot fired. Crucially, no one conducted extensive testing of the M16 with WC-846 ammunition before proving the change. The rifle had been tested and approved with IMR-4475. The ammunition change was treated as a simple substitution rather than a fundamental alteration to the weapons system. Army acceptance tests continued using remaining stocks of IMR-4475 loaded ammunition, even as millions of rounds of WC-846 ammunition were being produced for shipment to Vietnam. The second critical decision involved chrome plating. Eugene Stoner and the Colt engineers who manufactured the rifle strongly recommended chrome plating the chamber and bore. This was not a new or experimental technology. Chrome plating had been used in artillery barrels since World War I and in aircraft machine guns throughout World War II. The process involved electroplating a thin layer of chromium onto the steel surface, creating a hard, corrosion-resistant finish. Chrome plating would protect against corrosion in Vietnam's humid jungle environment and would help prevent cartridge cases from sticking in the chamber during extraction. The United States military had extensive experience with tropical corrosion from the Pacific theater of World War II. Weapons that performed flawlessly in temperate climates had corroded rapidly in the humidity of Pacific islands. Chrome plating had been identified as the solution decades earlier. The Army rejected this recommendation. Chrome plating added cost and production time to each rifle. Each chamber had to be carefully prepared, plated in an electroplating bath, and then inspected. The process added several steps to the manufacturing timeline. More importantly, traditionalists in Army ordnance worried that chrome plating would affect accuracy. Some target shooters believed that chrome-plated barrels were less accurate than bare steel, though testing had never confirmed this belief for military-grade accuracy standards. The decision was made to produce rifles without chrome-plated chambers despite warnings from the manufacturer. The Army cited the expense as cost-prohibitive, though no official documentation specifies the exact savings per rifle. Army ordnance believed that proper maintenance would prevent corrosion problems. This belief would prove catastrophically wrong in Vietnam's climate and combat conditions. The third decision would prove equally catastrophic. Colt had advertised the M16 as requiring minimal maintenance, far less than the MR-14. This was true when firing ammunition loaded with IMR-4475 in controlled conditions. Marketing materials in some early briefings described the rifle as nearly self-cleaning. The Army took this characterization at face value and failed to provide adequate cleaning equipment or training to troops deploying to Vietnam. Soldiers received their new M16s with virtually no cleaning kits, no instruction on proper maintenance procedures, and often with explicit statements that the rifle required little to no cleaning. Many were told the weapon was self-cleaning and that attempting to clean it improperly might damage it. This guidance would prove lethal when combined with the fouling properties of WC-846 and the lack of chrome plating in the chamber. The fourth modification compounded the emerging disaster. The original AR-15 lacked a forward assist, a device to manually ram the bolt fully forward if it failed to close on its own. Eugene Stoner had deliberately omitted this feature, reasoning that if the bolt would not close easily, something was wrong and the soldier should clear the malfunction rather than force it. Army ordnance insisted on adding a forward assist, arguing that soldiers needed the ability to force the rifle into battery. This seemingly minor change would later become a symbol of the systemic problems. Soldiers using the forward assist desperately trying to close bolts on chambers already fouled beyond function.
The first M16s arrived in Vietnam in early 1965. Initial issue went to elite units, Special Forces, Airborne, and the 1st Cavalry Division. These early deployments mostly used remaining stocks of IMR 4475 loaded ammunition and included soldiers who received better training and maintained their weapons meticulously. Reports from these units were largely positive. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore's 1st Battalion 7th Cavalry carried M16s into the Ia Drang Valley in November 1965. Moore, a West Point graduate and combat veteran of the Korean War, commanded 450 men organized into 4 rifle companies. They deployed aboard 16 UH-1D Huey helicopters, landing in waves at Landing Zone X-Ray. The landing zone was a clearing approximately 100 yards wide at the eastern base of the Chupong Massif, a mountain that rose to 2,400 feet and marked the border with Cambodia. Within 15 minutes of the first helicopter touching down, Moore's troops made contact with North Vietnamese forces. What followed was a desperate 3-day battle against elements of 3 North Vietnamese regiments, perhaps 2,000 enemy soldiers. The fighting was often at point-blank range, sometimes hand-to-hand. North Vietnamese forces launched human wave assaults. American soldiers fired their M16s on full automatic, burning through magazine after magazine. In that first major engagement between American and North Vietnamese regular forces, the M16 performed remarkably well for most soldiers. The rifle's high rate of fire and lightweight ammunition allowed troops to carry significantly more rounds than they could have with M14s. Lieutenant Colonel Moore had ordered his men to carry as much ammunition as possible. Many soldiers carried 300 to 400 rounds. In the desperate close-quarters fighting that characterized Ia Drang, this ammunition capacity proved decisive. American firepower combined with artillery support and tactical airstrikes prevented the North Vietnamese from overrunning the landing zone. Sergeant Ernie Savage, who fought in the battle, later described the experience. "I did not run out of ammunition. I had about 30 magazines in my pack and no problems with the M16. Savage's platoon held a critical position on the perimeter throughout the battle. The M16s functioned as designed. But Ia Drang represented the best-case scenario for the M16. These were well-trained soldiers of an elite air-mobile division. They had received better instruction on the new rifle than conventional infantry units would receive later. They maintained their weapons carefully. Most critically, many of the rifles at Ia Drang were still using ammunition loaded with IMR 4475 powder, the propellant the rifle had been designed to use. The weapons were relatively new, with chambers not yet corroded. The chaos of battle and the success of the engagement masked early warning signs of the problems that would emerge months later. As 1966 progressed and hundreds of thousands of M16s flooded into Vietnam, loaded exclusively with WC-846 ammunition and issued to conventional infantry units with minimal training, the crisis began to unfold. By mid-1966, reports started filtering back from Vietnam that the M16 was failing at catastrophic rates. Soldiers wrote desperate letters home describing rifles that jammed after firing just a few rounds. Officers filed official complaints stating that their men had lost confidence in their primary weapon. Medical evacuation helicopters brought back wounded men who reported their rifles had failed at the moment they needed them most. The failures followed a predictable and deadly pattern. After firing 10 to 20 rounds, especially in full automatic mode, the rifle would fail to extract the spent cartridge case. The sequence of the malfunction became grimly familiar to soldiers throughout Vietnam. The soldier would pull the trigger, the rifle would fire. The action would cycle, the bolt carrier driven backward by gas pressure. The extractor would attempt to pull the spent cartridge case from the chamber, but the case would stick, gripped by the corroded chamber walls and sealed by powder residue. The extractor, a small hooked-shaped piece of spring steel, would pull against the rim of the brass case. The soft brass would deform under the pressure. The extractor would tear through the rim, leaving the body of the cartridge wedged firmly in the chamber. The bolt carrier would cycle backward, ejecting only the torn brass rim. A fresh round would be stripped from the magazine and pushed forward by the bolt. But the bolt could not close. The chamber still contained the body of the previous cartridge case. The fresh round would jam against the stuck case. The action would be completely locked. The soldier would pull the trigger and hear only a click. The hammer had fallen on a firing pin that could not reach the primer because the bolt was not fully closed. At this point, the rifle was completely inoperable. No amount of manipulation of the charging handle or forward assist would clear the malfunction. The only way to clear this type of jam was to insert a cleaning rod down the barrel from the muzzle end and punch the stuck case backward out of the chamber. This required removing the magazine, locking the bolt to the rear, inserting a cleaning rod down the 20-inch barrel, and forcefully driving the stuck case out through the ejection port. But soldiers had not been issued cleaning rods. The rifle had been described as self-cleaning and requiring minimal maintenance. Cleaning kits, when they existed at all, were typically kept at base camps, not carried on patrol.
Even if a soldier had been issued a cleaning rod, performing this clearance procedure under fire was virtually impossible. It required using both hands, taking at least 30 seconds even for an experienced soldier, and left the soldier completely unable to defend himself. In a firefight, where the enemy might be 10 feet away in thick jungle, 30 seconds without a functioning weapon was a death sentence. Marine Corporal John Stevens wrote home in June 1966, "Out of 40 rounds I fired, my rifle jammed about 10 times. I pack as many grenades as I can, plus bayonet and K-bar jungle knife, so I will have something to fight with. If you can, please send me a bore rod and a 1 1/4-inch paintbrush. I need it. Our rifles are getting a lot of guys killed because they jammed so easily." The desperation in such letters reflects a soldier's worst nightmare: fighting in dense jungle, where the enemy could be 5 feet away, where contact happened without warning, where survival depended on immediate, overwhelming firepower, and discovering that your rifle would fire 5 rounds and then become a useless club. October 1966. The commanding officer of 1st Battalion, 2nd Infantry, 1st Infantry Division filed an official report. The new M16 E1 rifles are experiencing malfunctions to the extent that confidence has been degraded. His battalion had lost men in firefights when their rifles failed. Troops were beginning to pick up enemy AK-47 rifles from dead North Vietnamese soldiers, weapons they knew would fire reliably even when covered in mud. The AK-47 became the M16's devastating counterpoint. Designed in the Soviet Union by Mikhail Kalashnikov and adopted in 1947, the AK used a fundamentally different operating system. The AK employed a long-stroke gas piston. When the rifle fired, propellant gas was tapped from the barrel through a gas port, but instead of being channeled back into the bolt carrier as in the M16, the gas drove a long piston that was physically separate from the bolt carrier. The piston pushed the bolt carrier backward, then the piston returned forward while the bolt carrier continued cycling. This meant propellant gas in fouling never entered the action. All the combustion residue stayed in the gas tube and piston, completely separate from the bolt and chamber. The AK was also built with loose tolerances that allowed it to function when dirty, wet, or corroded. The bolt had significant clearance inside the receiver. Dirt and debris simply fell out through gaps in the design. The magazine was curved and designed to feed reliably even when dented or dirty. Every part of the weapon prioritized reliability over precision. Mikhail Kalashnikov had designed the weapon based on his experience as a Soviet tank commander in World War II. He knew that soldiers in combat conditions could not maintain weapons carefully. He designed a rifle that would work regardless of how badly it was treated. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters maintained their AK-47s poorly, if at all. Weapons were stored in underground caches where they were exposed to water, mud, and humidity for months. They were carried through rivers, dropped in rice paddies, buried when units retreated, yet the weapons functioned with near-perfect reliability. An AK could be pulled from a muddy stream. The bolt cycled once to clear water from the action, and the weapon would fire. American soldiers began to notice the contrast immediately. We found cases that had been buried in mud, dropped in rivers, left in the jungle for weeks. We picked them up, pulled the bolt back, and they fired. Our M16s jammed if you looked at them wrong. The contrast became a bitter joke among infantry units. The enemy had better rifles than we did. The underground market for captured AK-47s flourished. Officially, carrying enemy weapons was prohibited by regulations. American ammunition was not compatible with the AK, and carrying enemy weapons could lead to friendly fire incidents if a soldier was mistaken for the enemy. Unofficially, many squad leaders allowed or even encouraged their men to carry captured AKs. Some soldiers carried both an M16 and an AK, using the American rifle until it jammed, then switching to the Soviet weapon. A functioning AK was better than jammed M16. Soldiers understood this, even if Army regulations did not. The first official acknowledgement of the crisis came too slowly. Reports of malfunctions reached General William Westmoreland, commander of Military Assistance Command Vietnam. Westmoreland found himself in an impossible position. He had personally requested 100,000 M16s for Vietnam, praising the rifle as ideal for jungle warfare. He had visited units at Ia Drang shortly after the battle and heard positive reports about the weapon. He believed the rifle was a significant improvement over the M14 for the type of combat American forces faced in Southeast Asia. Yet soldiers under his command were writing home that the M16 was getting them killed. The complaints could not be ignored, but acknowledging the problem meant admitting a massive failure in weapons procurement.
In December 1966, the Marine Corps conducted a formal survey of 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines, after a series of engagements where rifle failures had caused casualties. The battalion had been involved in Operation Prairie, heavy fighting in the demilitarized zone near the North Vietnamese border. The survey was devastating. Approximately 80% of troops surveyed reported experiencing stoppages during combat operations. Many reported their rifles jamming after firing fewer than 10 rounds. Several Marines stated they had been wounded or seen fellow Marines killed because rifles failed during contact with the enemy. Some Marines reported firing only 3 or 4 rounds before experiencing complete weapon failure. The survey documented the types of malfunctions. Failure to extract was by far the most common, accounting for 80% of all stoppages. Failure to feed, where a fresh cartridge would not chamber properly, accounted for most of the remainder. Failure to fire, where the firing pin failed to ignite the primer, was relatively rare. The extraction failures followed the pattern that would become grimly familiar. The rifle would fire several rounds, then a cartridge case would stick in the chamber. The extractor would tear through the case frame. The rifle would be completely jammed. The survey included the most damning evidence yet. The I-Corps Committee investigation later confirmed that one Marine corporal had been killed while running up and down the line of his squad, trying to unjam other Marines' rifles with his cleaning rod. He was the only member of his squad who had managed to obtain a cleaning rod, apparently by trading with another unit. During a firefight, multiple Marines in the squad experienced extraction failures simultaneously. The corporal moved from position to position, using his cleaning rod to punch stuck cases out of chambers while under fire. He was shot and killed while clearing a jam from another Marine's rifle. His own rifle, functioning properly, was found next to his body. He had died trying to keep his squad in the fight. By early 1967, the stories were reaching the American public. Soldiers' letters home describing rifle failures began appearing in newspapers. One Marine officer wrote to Senator Gaylord Nelson, "The weapon has failed us at crucial moments. As many as 60% of the rifles failed to operate. I know of at least 2 Marines who died within 10 feet of the enemy with jammed rifles." Another letter from a Marine stated simply, "You know what killed most of us? Our own rifles, the M16. Families who had lost sons in Vietnam demanded to know if inadequate equipment had contributed to their deaths. On March 26, 1967, the Washington Daily News broke a major story about M16 reliability problems, featuring interviews with returning soldiers and excerpts from letters sent home from Vietnam. The article created a political firestorm. How could American troops be sent into combat with defective rifles? Why had the problems not been identified and corrected before widespread deployment? Who was responsible for decisions that prioritized cost and production speed over soldier safety? The pressure became impossible for Congress to ignore. On May 3, 1967, Representative L. Mendel Rivers, chairman of the House Committee on Armed Services, established a special subcommittee to investigate the M16 rifle program. Congressman Richard Icord, Democrat of Missouri, was appointed chairman of the subcommittee. He was joined by Representative Speedy O. Long of Louisiana and Representative William G. Bray of Indiana. The Icord Committee, as it became known, would conduct the most thorough investigation of a weapons procurement program in congressional history. Over the next 5 months, the committee held hearings on May 15th, 16th, and 31st, June 21st, July 25th, 26th, and 27th, and August 8th, 9th, and 22nd. All hearings were conducted at the Rayburn House Office Building in Washington. The committee examined every aspect of the M16 program. They reviewed procurement decisions going back to 1963. They analyzed test reports that had been filed and ignored. They studied engineering drawings and manufacturing specifications. They interviewed soldiers who had survived firefights where their rifles failed. They brought in weapons that had been recovered from casualties.
rifles found next to dead Americans with stuck cases still in the chambers. The picture that emerged was devastating. Every decision that had transformed the reliable AR-15 into the failing M16 was documented in detail. The switch from IMR 4475 to WC846 powder without adequate testing, the rejection of chrome plating despite manufacturer recommendations, the failure to provide cleaning equipment or training, the misleading claims about the rifle being self-cleaning, the increased cyclic rate that accelerated fouling, the quality control problems at Colt that allowed rifles to be shipped with defective parts.
Each failure was documented with technical data, engineering reports, and the testimony of soldiers who had paid the price. The committee discovered that multiple people had raised red flags about these issues before widespread deployment. Colt engineers had protested the ammunition change in writing. Company officials had stated explicitly that they could not guarantee weapon performance with the new powder. Eugene Stoner had recommended chrome plating in his original design specifications and had reiterated this recommendation when the Army began large-scale procurement. Air Force officers who had used the rifle successfully with proper ammunition and maintenance had emphasized the need for cleaning equipment and training. Test reports had shown increased malfunction rates with WC846 ammunition. All of these warnings had been ignored, dismissed, or buried in the urgency to get rifles to Vietnam and the desire to cut costs. The most damning revelation concerned who knew what and when. Army Ordnance had test data showing that WC846 ammunition caused increased malfunction rates. They had reports from Colt stating that the company could not guarantee rifle performance with WC846. They knew that rifles without chrome plating corroded in humid environments. They knew that soldiers were not receiving adequate training or cleaning equipment. Yet deployment had continued month after month while soldiers died because their rifles failed. The testimony of returned combat veterans proved particularly powerful. Marine Corporal Thomas Martinez testified about a firefight where his rifle jammed after the third round. He described using his jammed rifle as a club, suffering a bayonet wound, and watching his fire team leader die while trying to clear his own jammed rifle. Private First Class David Chen described finding a dead American patrol, all 7 men killed, all 7 M16s jammed, cleaning rods scattered around the bodies where the men had died trying to clear their weapons. Eugene Stoner explained his design philosophy for the committee. The AR-15 was engineered as a complete weapon system. The rifle, the ammunition, the maintenance procedures all worked together. Changing the ammunition without extensive testing broke the system. He had recommended chrome plating specifically because he knew the direct gas impingement system would be vulnerable to corrosion without it. He had never claimed the rifle was self-cleaning. That characterization had been invented by marketing departments and repeated by people who did not understand the weapon. Ballistics experts testified about the differences between IMR 4475 and WC846. The ball powder produced higher port pressures that increased the volume of gas and residue blown into the action. The calcium carbonate in WC846 created fouling that IMR 4475 did not. The increased cyclic rate meant more rounds fired before a soldier could react to a malfunction, leading to worse jams. All of this had been predictable. Some of it had been predicted. The predictions had been ignored. Representatives from Colt testified that they had raised concerns about the ammunition change. They stated in writing that they could not guarantee rifle performance with WC846 and that the increased cyclic rate violated Army acceptance standards. The Army had granted waivers allowing the higher cyclic rate. Quality control inspectors testified about finding defects in rifles being shipped to Vietnam, bolt carriers with improper hardness that would crack under stress, extractors with weak springs that would fail to pull stuck cases. They had rejected these rifles. The rejections had been overruled in the urgency to meet production quotas. The financial testimony exposed another dimension of the scandal. The decision to use WC846 saved money. Ball powder was cheaper and faster to produce than stick powder. Olin Mathieson had made substantial profits from ammunition contracts. The decision not to chrome plate chambers had saved production costs. While the committee found no evidence of outright corruption or bribery,
The cozy relationships between military procurement officers and defense contractors had clearly affected decision-making. Cost considerations and production convenience had outweighed combat effectiveness and soldier safety.
By August 1967, the E-Corps Committee had assembled an overwhelming case. The M16 failures were not the result of soldier incompetence or inadequate training alone. They were the result of systematic failures in weapons procurement, testing, and deployment. Multiple officials and organizations shared responsibility. Army Ordnance had approved the ammunition change without adequate testing. The Army Material Command had rejected manufacturer recommendations about chrome plating. Training commands had failed to develop proper maintenance instruction. Colt had continued production despite knowing about problems. Olin Mathewson had supplied ammunition that did not work properly with the rifle. Pentagon procurement officials had prioritized cost and speed over reliability.
The committee's formal report, released on October 19, 1967, contained extensive findings and recommendations. The switch to ball powder ammunition was identified as the primary cause of malfunctions. The lack of chrome plating in the chamber was the secondary cause. The failure to provide adequate cleaning equipment and training was the tertiary cause. The report recommended immediate action. Chrome plate all M16 chambers and bores. Develop improved ammunition with reduced fouling characteristics. Provide extensive cleaning kits to all troops carrying M16s. Implement comprehensive training programs on proper maintenance. Modify the rifle to reduce the cyclic rate. Establish better quality control in production. Create accountability for procurement decisions that affected soldiers' safety. The investigation generated enough political pressure that the Army could not continue its previous course. Changes began immediately, even before the final report was released. The Army had already begun standardizing the improved XM16E1 as the M16A1. The XM16E1 was type classified as the M16A1 on February 13, 1967, and officially adopted by the United States Army on February 28, 1967. Production of the improved rifle ramped up rapidly throughout the spring and summer. The M16A1 incorporated critical modifications that addressed every major failure point. The chamber and bore were chrome-plated, eliminating the corrosion problems that caused cases to stick. The chrome plating process added several manufacturing steps but proved essential. Each chamber was carefully prepared, cleaned, and then electroplated with a thin layer of hard chromium. The chrome created a smooth, corrosion-resistant surface. Spent cartridge cases no longer stuck in corroded chambers. Extraction failures dropped dramatically. A new buffer assembly reduced the cyclic rate back toward the original specifications. The buffer consisted of weights and springs inside the buttstock that absorbed the impact of the bolt carrier at the end of its rearward travel. The redesigned buffer used heavier weights and stiffer springs to slow the action cycling. This reduced the cyclic rate from over 900 rounds per minute back down to between 750 and 850 rounds per minute. The slower cyclic rate meant less violent action cycling and reduced stress on all components. The forward assist was strengthened and improved. While Eugene Stoner had opposed this feature, soldiers in the field found it useful when properly applied. The improved forward assist had a stronger pawl and could apply more force to close a reluctant bolt. However, training emphasized that the forward assist was for chambering around when loading the rifle quietly, not for forcing a jammed action. Most importantly, the designation change came with a complete overhaul of training and maintenance procedures. The self-cleaning myth was explicitly and publicly debunked. Army training commands rewrote all instruction materials. The new doctrine emphasized that the M16 required regular, thorough cleaning, especially in combat conditions. Field Manual 23-9 was completely rewritten with detailed cleaning instructions. The new manual included step-by-step procedures with photographs and diagrams. It specified exactly how to disassemble the rifle, what to clean, how to clean it, and how often. Soldiers were instructed to clean the chamber and bore after every firing session. The gas tube required cleaning weekly in combat conditions. The bolt and bolt carrier needed to be disassembled, cleaned, and lubricated daily when in the field.
Comic book-style manuals were produced showing soldiers exactly how to maintain their rifles. These manuals, with simple illustrations and step-by-step procedures, could be understood even by troops with limited literacy or for whom English was not their primary language. The comic format used clear drawings showing each step of disassembly and cleaning. Arrows indicated direction of movement. Text was minimal and simple. A soldier who could not read technical prose could follow the illustrated guide. Comprehensive cleaning kits were manufactured and distributed throughout Vietnam. Each kit contained everything needed to maintain the rifle in combat conditions. A 3-piece aluminum cleaning rod that could be screwed together to reach the full length of the barrel, a bore brush with stiff bronze bristles to scrub fouling from the rifling, a chamber brush specifically designed to clean the chamber walls where cases stuck, pipe cleaners to clean the gas tube without disassembling the rifle, cotton patches to wipe surfaces clean, a small bottle of lubricating oil, a toothbrush-style brush for cleaning the bolt and bolt carrier. The entire kit fit in a small plastic case that could be carried in a cargo pocket or attached to load-bearing equipment. Soldiers were required to clean their rifles daily in combat conditions, more often if they had fired expensively. Squad leaders inspected weapons regularly. Platoon sergeants conducted detailed inspections before and after operations. A dirty rifle was treated as a serious offense, equivalent to other failures of discipline.
The message was clear. Your rifle will work if you maintain it. It will fail if you neglect it. New training programs emphasized that the M16 required regular maintenance just like any other mechanical device. The self-cleaning myth was explicitly debunked in training classes. Drill instructors taught proper cleaning procedures and inspected rifles rigorously. Recruits spent hours learning to disassemble, clean, and reassemble their rifles until they could perform the procedure quickly and correctly even in darkness. Before deploying to Vietnam, soldiers received additional training specifically on maintaining weapons in tropical conditions. Most critically, the ammunition itself was improved. In 1970, a new powder designated WC-844 replaced WC-846 for 5.56mm ammunition. WC-844 had reduced calcium carbonate content, producing significantly less fouling. The combination of chrome plating and cleaner ammunition solved the extraction problem that had killed so many soldiers. The results were dramatic. By late 1967 and early 1968, units equipped with M16A1s, proper cleaning equipment, and adequate training reported substantial improvements in reliability. Malfunction rates dropped to levels comparable to or better than other military rifles. The extraction failures that had plagued the original M16 became rare. Soldiers who had despised and feared the M16 began to trust it. The rifle's inherent advantages could finally be realized without the crippling reliability problems. The lightweight meant soldiers could carry more ammunition or reduce the burden of their combat load. The high-capacity 30-round magazine gave sustained firepower in contact. The controllability and full automatic fire allowed accurate suppressive fire. The devastating terminal ballistics of the high-velocity 5.56mm round at close range proved highly effective in jungle combat. With chrome-plated chambers, proper cleaning, and improved ammunition, the M16A1 became the weapon it should have been from the beginning. In early 1968, the Army conducted comprehensive surveys of troops in Vietnam. The surveys were designed to measure soldier confidence in the improved rifle and identify any remaining problems. Results showed overwhelming satisfaction. The exact percentages varied depending on how questions were phrased, but approval ranged from 85% to 98% across different surveys. The February 1968 Department of Defense survey provided the most detailed data. 2,100 soldiers and Marines were surveyed about their combat experience with the M16A1. Only 38 individuals, less than 2%, stated they wanted to replace the M16 with a different weapon. The vast majority reported the rifle functioned reliably in combat. Most soldiers reported no significant malfunctions during the previous month of operations. When malfunctions did occur, they were typically minor feeding issues that could be cleared quickly, not the catastrophic extraction failures that had killed men a year earlier. An August to September 1967 survey conducted while improvements were being implemented found that 85% of respondents reported the M16 performed well in combat. 87% said they liked the weapon. A January to February 1968 survey found that 85% of troops wanted either the M16 or the XM17-7, a carbine version of the M16 for combat operations.
The remaining 15% preferred other weapons, but this was considered normal variation. No weapon satisfies all users under all conditions. The transformation was complete. A weapon that had been called a death trap, that soldiers had refused to carry, that men had died cursing, had become trusted and effective. The same basic design, when properly implemented with appropriate ammunition, chrome plating, cleaning equipment, and training, proved to be an excellent combat rifle. The human cost of the delay was incalculable. No one knows exactly how many American soldiers died because their M16s jammed during firefights. The number was certainly in the hundreds, possibly more. Each death was preventable. Each resulted from decisions made in offices thousands of miles from Vietnam, decisions that prioritized production speed and cost savings over human survival. Beyond deaths, thousands of soldiers had been wounded while fighting with jammed rifles or using inferior weapons. The psychological cost was equally severe. Soldiers lost faith not just in their rifles, but in the institution that had sent them into combat with defective equipment. The damage extended beyond individual tragedies. The M16 scandal became a symbol of everything wrong with the Vietnam War: hasty decisions, inadequate testing, prioritization of systems and statistics over human realities, disconnect between leadership and troops in the field. For many Americans, the story of soldiers dying with jammed rifles epitomized the war's larger failures. Marine Corporal Thomas Martinez, who testified before the Ichard Committee about his rifle jamming after 3 rounds in combat, survived Vietnam but carried the memory of that malfunction for the rest of his life. "I remember the feeling," he said decades later. "The click instead of the bang. Looking down at a useless piece of metal in my hands while the enemy was charging. That moment taught me that the people who sent us there didn't care enough to make sure our equipment worked."
Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, who fought with early M16s before receiving an M16A1, expressed the sentiment of many Vietnam veterans. "The early M16 was a death trap. We knew it. We reported it. Nothing happened for a year. Men died while bureaucrats argued about powder specifications and chrome plating costs. But the M16A1, once they fixed it, that was a different weapon. Best rifle I ever carried. Light, accurate, reliable when you maintained it. It's what the original should have been." The families of soldiers who died with jammed rifles received letters explaining that their sons had been killed in action. The letters did not mention that defective equipment had contributed to those deaths. For years, these families never knew that their loved ones had died fighting not just the enemy, but their own rifles. The story did not end in 1967. The M16A1 served throughout the remainder of the Vietnam War with increasing success. As soldiers learned proper maintenance and the weapon's quirks became familiar, the rifle evolved from liability to legend. By the 1970s, veterans who had cursed the early M16s praised the M16A1. The rifle continued to evolve through the M16A2, A3, A4, and eventually the M4 carbine, serving American forces for over 50 years and equipping armies around the world. The transformation happened because the problems were identified, investigated publicly, and corrected systematically. But the true legacy of the M16 crisis extended far beyond the rifle itself. The Ichard Committee's investigation established precedents for congressional oversight of weapons programs that continue today. Before the M16 scandal, weapons procurement had largely been an internal military matter. Congress appropriated funds but rarely questioned technical decisions about weapons design, testing, or deployment. The military and defense contractors operated with minimal outside scrutiny. The Ichard investigation changed this fundamentally. The concept of soldier feedback became institutionalized. Before Vietnam, weapons were tested by ordnance experts and evaluated by technical specialists. The opinions of ordinary soldiers who would actually carry the weapons into combat were rarely solicited and often dismissed when offered. The M16 crisis demonstrated that soldiers in combat conditions discovered problems that laboratory testing missed. Their feedback was not merely anecdotal complaint, but essential operational data. The Army established formal mechanisms for troops to report equipment problems. After the war, the Army created the Product Quality Deficiency Report System, allowing soldiers to file official reports about equipment failures. These reports were tracked, investigated, and could trigger engineering changes or procurement modifications. Similar systems were established for all services. The voice of the soldier in the field gained authority it never possessed before.
Operational testing in combat conditions became mandatory before full-scale deployment of new weapons. The practice of adopting a weapon based solely on laboratory testing and limited field trials ended. New rifles, machine guns, and other individual weapons now undergo extensive operational testing by combat units in realistic conditions. Test units file detailed reports on reliability, maintainability, and combat effectiveness. Procurement decisions cannot proceed without positive operational test results. Procurement regulations were tightened to prevent the kinds of waivers and shortcuts that had caused the M16 disaster. The practice of granting waivers that allowed weapons to be fielded despite failing to meet specifications came under intense scrutiny. New regulations required that any waiver to acceptance standards be documented, justified in writing, and approved at high levels of authority. The casual granting of waivers that had allowed defective M16s to be shipped to Vietnam became much more difficult. Quality control inspections became more rigorous and independent. Previously, contractors often performed their own quality control with minimal oversight. After the M16 scandal, government inspectors gained more authority to reject defective weapons even if contractors accepted them. The practice of overruling inspector rejections to meet production quotas was forbidden by new regulations. Manufacturing defects had to be corrected, not ignored. Congressional oversight of major weapons programs became routine and aggressive. The House and Senate Armed Services Committees established permanent subcommittees dedicated to weapons procurement oversight. These subcommittees conduct regular reviews of major programs, hold hearings on problems reported from the field, and can halt procurement if problems are not addressed. The defense industry learned that cutting corners on soldier safety would trigger public investigations that could destroy contracts and reputations. The cozy relationships between procurement officers and defense contractors came under scrutiny. Regulations were established requiring disclosure of communications between military officials and defense contractors. The revolving door, where military officers retired and immediately joined defense contractors they had dealt with, became subject to ethical reviews and waiting periods.
Most importantly, the fundamental lesson was learned: a weapon system must be tested as a complete system. Changing one component affects the entire system. Cost savings that compromise reliability are not savings at all when measured in lives lost. Contractor recommendations about their own products should be heeded, not dismissed for convenience. Soldiers' complaints from the field should be investigated immediately, not buried in bureaucracy. The M16 crisis established a principle that transcends any individual weapon. Transparency and accountability save lives. When the early M16s failed in Vietnam, the initial military response was to blame soldiers for inadequate maintenance. Training bulletins emphasized proper cleaning procedures, implying that soldier negligence caused the malfunctions. This approach shifted responsibility away from the institutional decisions that had created the problem. It took soldiers' letters home, newspaper articles, grieving families demanding answers, and congressional investigation to force acknowledgement that the system itself had failed. The I-Cord Committee's decision to hold public hearings rather than classified sessions proved crucial. The testimony of combat veterans describing their rifles jamming, the technical testimony explaining how calcium carbonate fouling caused extraction failures, the documentary evidence showing that warnings had been ignored, all of this became part of the public record. Defense contractors and military officials could not dismiss or bury the evidence. The American people knew their soldiers had been sent into combat with defective rifles. The political pressure became impossible to resist. The public nature of the investigation also served another purpose. It educated the defense establishment about what would happen if such failures occurred again. Future procurement officials understood that cutting corners on soldier safety could result in public humiliation, congressional investigation, and career destruction. The threat of transparency became a powerful deterrent against future negligence. The reforms that followed the M16 scandal, improved testing, soldier feedback mechanisms, quality control, congressional oversight, all depended on the principle that equipment failures affecting soldier safety would be investigated publicly and thoroughly. This principle has been tested repeatedly in the decades since Vietnam. When the M24 9-squad automatic weapon experienced reliability problems in the 1980s, soldiers' complaints triggered immediate investigation and corrections. When body armor proved inadequate in Iraq, congressional hearings forced the Pentagon to accelerate improved armor fielding. When mine-resistant vehicles were needed in Afghanistan, public pressure overrode bureaucratic resistance to rapid procurement. None of these responses were perfect, but all followed the pattern established by the M16 crisis. Soldiers report problems, media covers the issue, Congress investigates, reforms are implemented. The system works imperfectly, but it works because the M16 disaster taught both the military and the public that equipment failures cannot be hidden or ignored. In 1985, 20 years after Yan Drang, veterans of the 1st Cavalry Division held a reunion in Texas. Many brought their families to show them where their service had begun. Among the attendees were men who had fought with the original M16s at Yan Drang and men who had struggled with jammed rifles in later battles. The conversations around hotel bars and reunion dinners often turned to weapons. Veterans compared their experiences with different rifles, the M14 some had trained with, the early M16s that had failed them, the M16A1 that earned their trust. One veteran who had carried an M16 through 13 months in Vietnam from 1967 to 1968 captured the complex feelings many shared. "I hated that rifle for 6 months. Every time I went on patrol, I wondered if it would jam when I needed it. I carried extra grenades, carried a K-bar knife, even carried a captured AK for a while. Then I got an M16A1 with a chrome chamber and a cleaning kit, and someone actually showed me how to maintain it properly. After that, it never let me down. Best rifle I ever carried. But I'll never forget those first 6 months when I couldn't trust my own weapon." Another veteran added, "The rifle that killed my friend wasn't an AK-47. It was an M16 that jammed while he was in contact. He died trying to clear it. That should never have happened. Someone in Washington decided that chrome plating cost too much and that soldiers didn't need cleaning equipment. That decision killed him as surely as enemy fire." The M16's evolution from failure to success illustrated a truth about military equipment. Good design alone is not enough. The R-15 that Eugene Stoner designed was an excellent rifle. The M16 that arrived in Vietnam in 1966 with wrong ammunition, no chrome plating, no cleaning equipment, and inadequate training was a disaster. The M16A1 that served from 1968 onward with all the corrections in place became one of the most successful military rifles in history. The same design, different implementations, life or death outcomes. By the 1980s, the M16 family had become so successful that it was difficult for younger soldiers to understand the early failures. Recruits trained with reliable M16A2s that functioned flawlessly with modern ammunition and proper maintenance. The rifle's lightweight, accuracy, and controllability were taken for granted.
Vietnam veterans sometimes tried to explain to these younger soldiers what the early M16s had been like, but the stories seemed almost impossible to believe. How could the same basic rifle have been so unreliable? How could the military have sent soldiers into combat with weapons that jammed after firing a few rounds? The answers, wrong ammunition, no chrome plating, inadequate training, seemed like such obvious mistakes in retrospect that younger soldiers struggled to understand how they had been made in the first place. But the Vietnam veterans knew the answer: urgency, cost pressure, institutional arrogance, and the assumption that soldiers would adapt to whatever equipment they were given. These factors had combined to create a disaster that killed hundreds before public outrage forced corrections. The lasting impact of the M16 crisis extended to how the American military develops, tests, and fields equipment. Modern weapons procurement follows procedures that trace directly back to lessons learned from the M16 disaster. When the Army began developing a new rifle to eventually replace the M16 family, the process incorporated every reform that had emerged from the Vietnam experience. The Next Generation Squad Weapon Program, which aims to field a new rifle and automatic rifle to infantry units, follows a development process that would have prevented the M16 disaster. Extensive prototype testing by combat soldiers, not just ordnance experts. Multiple contractors compete through realistic testing phases. Soldiers evaluate weapons in conditions simulating combat: mud, water, extreme temperatures, sustained firing. Feedback from users drives design modifications. No weapon advances to the next phase without positive evaluations from soldiers who would actually carry it. The ammunition and weapon are developed together as an integrated system. The contractor cannot simply substitute different ammunition after the weapon is approved. Any ammunition change triggers new testing of the complete weapon system. The lesson that changing from IMR 4475 to WC 846 broke the M16 system is now embedded in procurement regulations. Independent testing organizations evaluate reliability, durability, and maintainability. Contractors cannot simply declare their weapons meet specifications. Government testers conduct thousands of rounds of firing tests, measure malfunction rates, evaluate maintenance requirements, and assess performance in adverse conditions. Test results are documented and reviewed at multiple levels before procurement decisions are made. Soldiers receive comprehensive training on new weapons before combat deployment. The self-cleaning myth that killed soldiers in Vietnam could not happen today. Training programs for new weapons include detailed maintenance instruction, hands-on practice, and evaluation to ensure soldiers understand how to maintain their equipment. Cleaning kits and maintenance materials are fielded simultaneously with the weapons themselves. Congressional oversight occurs throughout the development process, not just after disasters. Armed Services Committee staff monitor major weapons programs, review test results, visit testing facilities, and interview soldiers using new equipment. Problems are identified and addressed before weapons are fielded to combat units. These reforms did not emerge automatically. Each represented a specific response to specific failures exposed by the M16 investigation. The reformed system works because the price of the original failures was so high that the military and Congress committed to preventing repetition. The true memorial to the soldiers who died because their M16s failed is not carved in stone. It exists in the procurement regulations, testing procedures, and oversight mechanisms that ensure future soldiers receive reliable equipment. Every time a new weapon undergoes extensive soldier testing, the ghost of those jammed M16s stands behind the evaluators. Every time a contractor recommendation about chrome plating or ammunition is heeded rather than dismissed, the memory of Vietnam influences the decision. Every time Congress holds hearings on equipment problems reported from combat zones, the precedent of the I-Cord Committee investigation shapes the process. The soldiers who wrote desperate letters home describing their rifles jamming, the Marines who died with cleaning rods in their hands trying to keep their squads in the fight, the officers who filed complaint after complaint until someone finally listened, these men bought reforms with their lives. Their deaths were preventable tragedies, but those tragedies, once exposed and investigated, forced changes that have saved countless lives since. The M16 itself became a different weapon because of what happened in Vietnam. Modern soldiers carrying M4 carbines, direct descendants of the original AR-15, benefit from chrome-lined chambers, improved ammunition, comprehensive cleaning kits, and thorough training. These features exist because soldiers in Vietnam died without them, and their deaths could not be hidden or ignored. In 2018, a group of Vietnam veterans visited the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. They had all served in infantry units in 1966 and 1967, the worst years of the M16 crisis. As they walked along the black granite wall, finding the names of friends who had not come home, one veteran stopped at a particular panel.
He died with a jammed rifle in his hands, the veteran said quietly. We were in a firefight near Chu Lai. His M16 jammed after 5 rounds. He was trying to clear it when he got hit. I couldn't help him because my rifle had jammed too. Another veteran added, Sometimes I wonder if his name would be on this wall if his rifle had worked. Maybe he'd be standing here with us instead." A third veteran, who had been listening, spoke. "A lot of names on this wall are here because of equipment that failed, orders that made no sense, strategies that didn't work. But at least with the M16, somebody finally investigated, somebody finally fixed it. That's something." The first veteran nodded slowly. "Yeah, it's something. Came too late for him. But the kids who went to Iraq and Afghanistan, they carried rifles that worked because ours didn't. I guess that matters." The story of the M16 in Vietnam is ultimately a story about institutional failure and institutional reform. The weapon failed American soldiers because decisions made in offices, boardrooms, and factories prioritized factors other than combat effectiveness and soldier survival. Production speed, cost savings, bureaucratic convenience, and institutional pride all contributed to fielding a rifle that had been systematically degraded from its original design. Soldiers died as a direct result of these decisions. The deaths would have continued indefinitely if the military had been left to handle the problem internally. The initial response was denial, then blame shifting to soldiers for inadequate maintenance. Change came only when soldiers' letters reached the American public, when newspapers investigated, when families demanded answers, and when Congress forced a public reckoning. The I-Cord Committee's investigation exposed every failure in excruciating detail. Wrong ammunition, no chrome plating, inadequate training, ignored warnings, quality control failures, and the bureaucratic culture that allowed all these problems to persist while men died. The reforms that followed, chrome plating, improved ammunition, cleaning kits, comprehensive training, better testing procedures, and congressional oversight transformed the M16 from death trap to trusted weapon. The same basic rifle that soldiers had refused to carry in 1966 became the weapon they praised in 1970 and beyond. But the deeper lesson transcends the M16 itself. The crisis taught the American military and the American public that equipment failures affecting soldier safety cannot be tolerated, cannot be hidden, and cannot be blamed on the users rather than the designers and decision-makers. The principle of transparency and accountability established through the pain of the M16 crisis has since been applied to body armor, vehicles, communications equipment, and countless other systems. When soldiers report problems, those reports now trigger investigations rather than reprimands. When testing reveals failures, those failures must be corrected before deployment. When equipment proves inadequate in combat, rapid solutions are demanded rather than excuses. None of this works perfectly. Bureaucracy still resists change. Cost pressures still tempt shortcuts. But the system functions better than it did before Vietnam because the M16 disaster established that equipment failures will be investigated publicly and corrected forcefully. The men who died with jammed rifles in the jungles of Vietnam deserved better from their country. They deserved equipment that worked. They deserved leaders who listened to their warnings. They deserved a system that put their survival ahead of production schedules and cost savings. They did not receive what they deserved in their lifetimes. But their deaths, once exposed, forced the creation of a better system for soldiers who followed. The reforms born from their tragedy have saved thousands of lives in conflicts from Grenada to Iraq, from Somalia to Afghanistan. The machine gun cruiser USS Helena earned her nickname through sheer firepower and refused to die at Pearl Harbor, returning with vengeance. The M16 rifle earned its redemption differently. Not through refusing to die, but through dying publicly enough that the system could not ignore the failure and was forced to reform. The soldiers who carried jammed M16s through the jungles of Vietnam fought two wars simultaneously. They fought the enemy in front of them with whatever weapons would function: grenades, knives, captured AK-47s, and occasionally their own rifles when those rifles worked. And they fought a second war through letters home, official complaints, and desperate testimony that eventually forced their own military to fix the equipment that was supposed to protect them. They won both wars, though the victory in the second came too late for hundreds of men who died in the first. The M16 failed American soldiers in Vietnam. Then America fixed the M16. That sequence, failure, exposure, investigation, reform, defines both the tragedy and the triumph of the story. The tragedy was preventable. The triumph was earned. Together they taught lessons that shaped American military procurement for generations. In the end, the greatest tribute to the men who died with jammed rifles is not words, but action. The chrome-lined chambers, the cleaning kits, the training programs, the testing procedures, and the oversight mechanisms that ensure future soldiers receive equipment worthy of their sacrifice. The M16 story is a tale of tragedy turned reform, a weapon that failed American soldiers, then forced America to fix how it makes war.